Welcome to Lesson 6, External Words, Phrases, and Dependent Clauses, Part 2. As we discussed in the last lesson, there are three places where you can safely add external words, phrases, and dependent clauses onto a foundational clause. Those three places are before the actor, between the actor and the action, and after the answer. Today we're going to focus on adding external information to the end of a foundational clause. Now don't forget, if it is indeed external information, you must set it off with a comma. When adding a word, phrase, or dependent clause in front of the actor, like in the last lesson, the additional information is almost always set off with a comma, but this is not necessarily the case when one adds information to the end of a simple sentence. In order to properly place new information at the end of the foundational clause, we must learn to differentiate between internal and external phrases and clauses. Internal phrases and clauses add necessary clarity to a sentence. Without them, the meaning of the foundational clause would change, sometimes drastically. Because they are necessary, do not separate them with a comma. They are usually inside the foundational clause, functioning with or as an actor, action, or answer. When phrases or clauses come after the answer and they're connected with the word that or some kind of subordinating conjunction, you probably won't need the comma. He took the car to the shop because it needed repairs. Because it needed repairs is a dependent clause. Because is a subordinating conjunction. It eliminated the need for the comma. It allowed the sentence to flow smoothly without any pause. Of course, we also discussed if you can treat the additional information as an answer, it becomes kind of internalized anyway, and therefore the comma is not needed. He took the car to the shop. Why? For repairs. So because it's kind of like an answer, we don't need a comma. So let's test this out on our foundational clause from the last lesson. The building towered above the city. We just said most subordinating conjunctions in the word that usually make phrases and clauses at the end of a simple sentence internalized. In other words, we won't need to use a comma to connect them to the foundational clause. So, that was now dark is a dependent clause. The word that removes the need for the comma. Our new sentence would read, the building towered above the city that was now dark. So no comma. Let's try it with a subordinating conjunction. While the stars sparkled overhead. The building towered above the city while the stars sparkled overhead. So again, the subordinating conjunction removed the need for a comma. One more time. This time we're going to add an additional little phrase, but we're going to treat it like an answer. The building towered above the city when? At night. So again, because it's kind of like an answer, we don't need a comma. So hopefully we now feel comfortable with phrases and dependent clauses when they're internal. Let's talk about external phrases and dependent clauses. They add unnecessary information to the foundational clause. They might be important, but removing them does not alter the main clause in the sentence. Because they are not necessary, they are separated with a comma. They exist outside the syntactic slots of the foundational clause. An example would be, we saw them after sundown, the sky darkening with their approach. That extra information could be removed. That's why it's set off with a comma. We saw them after sundown, which was later than we expected. Again, we have unnecessary information that could be removed, and the foundational clause would be fine without it. Let's first look at phrases at the end of the foundational clause. When do we know whether or not it is external or internal? Well, here's the big tip. With phrases, two or more equal adjectives, an ing word, or an ed word generally indicate that any addition to the end of a sentence should be treated as external. What does that mean? Well, let's try a watchful sentinel blotting out the night sky. Now, technically, this does not begin with an ing or an ed word, but you can see the word blotting in there, and that is the ing word we're looking for. That's what's going to suggest this is external. The sentence would read, the building towered above the city, a watchful sentinel blotting out the night sky with its presence. Let's try another one. The sky marred by its presence. Again, the first word is not an ed word, but the third word, marred, is, and that's what we're looking for. If you see that ed word, watch out. The building towered above the city, the sky marred by its presence. And finally, let's add two equal adjectives and see what happens. The building towered above the city, dark and intimidating. What about dependent clauses? How do we know if they're external or not? Well, With clauses, the relative pronouns which and who usually indicate that an addition to the end of a sentence should be treated as external. What does that mean? Well, we are talking about a city here, not a person, so we wouldn't use who, but we could use which seemed unnaturally silent at this hour. That dependent clause fits right in with the foundational clause, but you do have to set it off with a comma. The building towered above the city, which seemed unnaturally silent at this hour. The big things to watch out for when phrases or clauses appear at the end of foundational clauses, the ones that really let you know that you probably need a comma, are the words which and any ing or ed words. I remember the old tree, which was now leafless and looked about ready to fall over. He darted out of the alley, gasping and apparently terrified. He had taken to her on the first day, mesmerized by her beauty. So those three indicators, which, ing words, and ed words, those are the ones you have to watch out for the most. And as we said in the last lesson, remember, the external information must be a word, a phrase, or a dependent clause. We still are not adding additional independent clauses yet. That will be coming in a few lessons. Of course, remember what we've learned so far? The foundation of sentence building is the independent clause. Do not forget the actor, the action, and the answer. You must have those three things before you can build complicated sentences. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you will join me in the next lesson when we finish up our conversation on external words, phrases, and dependent clauses. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.